western end of the tell, Göbekli Tepe behind us, and we're just looking out across this landscape. And so, Lee, I mean, this barren landscape. Now, I mean, you say barren, but I mean, okay, there's olive groves and what have you. But it looks harsh. But 10,000 years ago, this was lush, and people living here, just going out onto the landscape and being able to gather enough grain or Lord knows what to keep themselves going. What's the thinking on how people were actually living with the landscape back then?
Okay, I mean, the best indications we have for how the landscape was are, of course, on the one hand, archaeobotanical remains, and on the other, the animal remains of the hunted quarry and what they were using. So, we know for a fact that they were hunting a lot of gazelle, so we'd have a gazelle moving around the landscape. They were hunting aurochs, they were hunting wild boar, the three most important animals perhaps. And of course, those animals require certain, landscapes to live in. So, especially with the wild boar and the aurochs, I mean, obviously it was a lot wetter and moister than it was today. And, thinking, today what we're seeing here is a cultural landscape, obviously, over 10,000 plus years. We've got grazing going on here, we've got a lot of farming going on here. I mean, just out of shot here, we've got it is a lot greener, but that's because of the water coming in from the dams and from the lakes that have been made. By us, by humans, as it were. And so they're farming a lot of the time in the year. But so it's a cultural landscape. But at the time, we also know that they were using certain woods. We've got charcoal remains, for example. We've got other botanical remains. So they were collecting wild cereals. We talk there of pre-domestication cultivation, all the grinding stones. And we've got the animal remains, as I say. So it would have been like an open woodland. It would have been, scattered with oaks and wild almond, that sort of thing, and with watery or moister areas where these animals that I just mentioned were gathering, where they could be hunted. So a very, like I said, a lush landscape compared to what we have today, to this cultural landscape.
Because so many people are confused by the thing that they've heard that this is a hunter-gatherer site, and they can't associate this site with people who are being nomadic, which is what has got fixed in people's minds. So I suppose it's putting Göbekli Tepe in the whole chronology of the development of farming from the broad spectrum that we know about from even 10,000 years before Göbekli Tepe itself came into existence. Yeah,
I mean, we're talking about a long duration, the longue durée of this transition from mobile hunter-gathering to sort of sedentary farming. It took many thousands of years, and we're actually in the middle of that, you could say, here at Göbekli Tepe, although I have to stress we don't have any domesticated animals or plant species so far in the archaeological record. So what we're dealing with here, and we know that people were living here, we've got the domestic buildings to prove that. We have the grinding stones, for example, which can't be moved around very easily, obviously because it's so heavy. So we are expecting that the people here were sedentary hunter-gatherers, or hunter-foragers. They were using Göbekli Tepe as a base. They were still very mobile. I mean, in the early years of the site, we think that the site was first occupied in the second half of the 10th millennium BC. So with the Holocene climate amelioration coming in, after the Younger Dryas, things were, looking a bit better climate-wise. And they were still mobile, as I say. They were going out hunting, they were going out gathering and foraging, but they had this as their base, as it were. And in the early years, in the PPNA, we're looking around 9,500 BC to about 8,700 BC. We've got evidence of domestic buildings from that period. But of course, we don't know, they're only in small areas of the excavation, so we don't know how big that settlement was. But at least, and we don't know how often, or perhaps they were visiting frequently, and at the beginning not actually sort of being sedentary here, and then that increased in the course of time. And by the PPNB, later on by the mid-9th millennium BC, we've got a flourishing settlement. So I think that in the course of the duration of the site, we're having an increasing sort of level of people staying put and the settlement developing. Yeah.
So I'll tell you what, I suggest that we actually get up and walk around a bit.
An interesting aspect, though, is when we know that people could harvest such large quantities of wild grains, and that they needed to settle down. Well, they had to settle down because they couldn't carry that around with them. If you've collected enough grain for months and months, potentially even for a year, you can't carry that. So you've got to settle down. And do we have sites like this developing over time because people needed to settle down in the first place?
So you're talking about storage now. I mean, whether we have evidence for storage of sort of wild grain or what have you during the Neolithic. I mean, we don't have the stores. We don't have the grain, heaps of grain that we have excavated. Other sites do have that, but we don't have that here. I mean, what we do have, of course, are smaller rooms. Even in the PPNA sort of domestic area that we excavated a few years back, we did have smaller sort of conglomerative sort of building structures which could have been used for storage, although there wasn't any finds of like stored cereals in that or wild cereals in those buildings. But later on in the course of time, of course, we do find these great big sort of limestone vessels that do appear and which, in my opinion, were used for storage, perhaps for storage of certain groups or families living in a certain area of the site. Yeah. So, these are very big sort of limestone vessels. And I think that's one piece of evidence that we can't sort of, pass by. So I think in the course of this sort of period that the period that Göbekli Tepe was settled, from the mid-10th millennium to sort of the end of the 9th, we have an increase also not only in the sedentism but also in the storage capabilities.
For me, now having seen the enormity of the site, I must qualify that, the enormity of the bit of Göbekli Tepe that you've excavated so far, so the implication is extraordinary about the size of the settlement, and put it that way, is that these people absolutely had the environment handled and how they could extract the most from the environment. This landscape stretching out, before us, and we just underestimate how they were utilising that landscape, both in terms of gathering whatever grains it was, or hunting gazelle, it seems, on an almost industrial scale.
And not only that, I mean, you think about what also do you need when you're living in a settlement. You need water. And they were actually harvesting the rainwater. And we have good evidence of that. We have small, in the rocks here along the edge of the plateau, we have cisterns, for example. And a few years back as well, actually we have on site, within the northwestern part of the site that you can see behind us here, we have also channels carved into the bedrock, which were covered by limestone slabs, where they were channeling the water. And then on the other side of this sort of depression here in the northwestern part of the site, we have a very large pit, 8 meters wide in diameter, 3 meters deep, where we actually think they were actually storing the rainwater. So a very big cistern on site in the settlement. Right. And that's perhaps not the only one that we have here. As you say, only a fraction of the site's been excavated. Yes. So they knew what they were doing. They had the technology to provide enough foodstuffs, victuals for the people here in living at the site, for providing water. It was a very advanced community.
The settlement, the residential areas that we've looked at in the main site, where you've shown us, I mean, the whole scope potentially around the tell, that really these could be spreading out in so many directions from the tell. So we don't really have a clue how vast the site.
Right, well, that's a problem because, of course, we've got different areas under excavation, and those different areas are not connected. We have radiocarbon data, of course, but that doesn't give us a resolution to connect the different parts of the site. Mm-hmm. So, as you probably know, on a tell, settlement can shift from one part of the tell, one part of the site to another over the course of time. Yeah. We don't know what's going on there yet, but at least in the PPMB period, at the main excavation area, you saw the rectangular buildings on the slope. We know that the special buildings below were also overlapping in time with those domestic structures. And a lot of those domestic structures are sharing walls, they're agglomerating. And if they were all contemporaneous, which I think they were, then we're looking at quite a dense settlement. You could say, I'm not going to give numbers here because it's difficult to give those numbers, but we could be looking like a mega site, a really quite developed settlement, and that's important to realise for the later part of the settlement history. We're talking about the 9th millennium BC.
all things in time. Maybe it helps illustrate by telling us, what that is behind you, because we can't fail to notice something looking suspiciously like a spaceship.
Yeah.
Let's walk over there.
Yeah, let's walk over there. So, in last few years, these shelters have been built. We're also a UNESCO site now, and before we became a UNESCO site, we had these shelters constructed, protective shelters for the archaeology. One of them is over the main excavation area, and it's sort of, visitors walk around there. There's a visitor pathway, and this one is still not accessible to the public. This is one that's actually just for us archaeologists to give us some shade for our work and to protect obviously the monuments underneath. And in this area, you can see where the legs of this structure go down into the ground. They're actually anchored into the limestone plateau. And of course, before we could do that work, or before that work was done, of course, we had to remove all the archaeology. So this gave us a really good insight into the entire stratigraphy of the site in these areas, down to the limestone plateau. And it was in one of these, in fact, in the one just in front of us, that we have this very early evidence for domestic architecture. We have an activity zone with a hearth or several hearths. We have evidence for bone tools. It's a very dense. Usually we do find bone tools occasionally at the site, but here there were higher frequencies of bone tools. We also have evidence for bead production, so they're making beads, sitting around the hearth, around the campfire, between the domestic structures, making beads from bird bone and stone. So really, and of course the finds coming out of here, we've got obviously lots of lithics from the knapping that was going on. We've got grinding stones. So it really smells like a domestic site. Yeah. And compared to other sites of the same time, PPNA, so last half of the 10th millennium, the structures that we found here are very comparable. So we're very certain that we have, from the earliest levels of the site, constructed directly, or more or less directly, onto the natural limestone plateau, the earliest occupation levels.
So you mentioned the room down there where there's evidence for bead making around, was it around the hearth?
I think they were probably sitting around the hearth, knapping stone tools, lithics, and bead production. We've got the bone tools going on, so they're perhaps even sewing or that sort of thing.
So it's the thing is, it's the making of the beads for me that you don't sit around making yourself fancy jewellery if you haven't really got life pretty sorted out.
Well, I think that's a bit of a misnomer about the Stone Age, that people always think they were struggling to survive. They were off there trying to hunt the animals and to survive every day. But of course, here we can see that isn't the case, even before that, obviously. But I mean, this is, the people knew what they were doing. They had technologies that probably we don't even, know of today, or haven't discovered yet. In fact, I mean, I mentioned the water systems, for example. Yes. That's something new on site. The channels and everything. So they had it sussed. Yeah, you're quite right.
Fantastic.